Today I'll be going over the best video settings for the GoPro Hero 8, including some example footage of these settings. Now, there are many different types of GoPro users and many different ways this camera can be used, so thankfully GoPro has created preset profiles that you can store and organize your settings so that you can easily switch between them based on what you're doing. I'll be going over settings that cover the casual user all the way to the more advanced user that wants to squeeze out every drop of image quality from their GoPro, so let's dive into the settings. The first group of settings we're going to cover is the casual user. This is the person who just wants to turn on the GoPro and start capturing footage that looks good straight out of the camera. This is going to be the longest section because I'm going to cover what each setting does, so I won't have to explain it every time. So starting with resolution, I'm going to say this now because it applies to every group of settings I'm going to cover. The higher the resolution, obviously the higher the quality, but the trade-off is that it takes more computer processing power, so if your computer is struggling to play or edit the footage, then lower the resolution. So when I say 4K, translate that to whatever the highest resolution your computer can handle that doesn't slow down your workflow. For frame rate, I always choose 24 unless I'm doing slow motion. Some people like the way 30 looks, some people like the way 60 looks, but 24 is what my videos are edited in. This video that you're watching right now is in 24. Most movies are in 24. 24 it is for me. For lens, let's go with linear. This is for the normal looking footage. If you go wider than that, then you start getting that fisheye distortion in the image. If you don't mind that and you want a wider image, then choose wide or super view. For hypersmooth, your options will depend on what you chose in the last two settings. Generally, the higher the setting, the smoother it is. And being that I chose 4K at 24 frames per second and a linear field of view, I'm able to use the new Hypersmooth 2.0 boost feature, which allows super smooth footage. Remember that the higher the hypersmooth setting is, the more it crops in on the image to stabilize it. So if you use not as wide of a field of view as you would like, then dial back on the hypersmooth. Now because I have on ProTune, I'm going to skip down to bitrate. High bitrate allows more data to be recorded, so you have a high quality footage at the expense of bigger file sizes. Large memory cards are pretty cheap nowadays, and file sizes are still small compared to normal cameras, so it's not that big of a deal. But if you want to save some space and accept a slightly lower image quality, go with low. For shutter speed, we're going to leave it on auto because this won't matter to the casual user, so it's just best to let the camera adjust it for you. Let's skip EV compensation for now and go to white balance. For the casual user, this is another setting to leave on auto. This basically will allow the camera to adjust what white looks like based on the lighting that you're in to make sure all the colors in your image are what they should be. So if you walk from a room that has really warm and orange looking lighting to another room with cooler white looking lighting, the camera automatically adjusts the color temperature. The ISO setting basically cranks up the gain on the camera sensor when it doesn't have enough light. The lower the setting, the better the image quality, so in any daylight situation, there's no need to crank this up. But when you go into a lower light situation, that's when the ISO may need to go to a higher number. The GoPro allows us to set a range for the ISO, so the minimum, of course, let's go with 100, and the maximum I leave at 1600. The camera can go higher, but GoPros are in no way good in low light, so anything beyond that usually just looks really bad. So the minimum of 100 and the maximum of 1600, and it'll decide where it needs to be between there. Now let's go back to EV compensation. Let's set this to 0. What this does is tell the camera that you want the image to be brighter or darker than what the camera thinks is correct. So since we have the shutter and ISO set to auto, the camera will adjust those settings based on what it thinks the image should look like. But when you disagree with the camera and you want it to be darker or brighter than what the camera is giving you, you can raise or lower this number and it will compensate for that. So if a scene is too bright, drop the EV compensation down and the camera will adjust the settings it thought was proper to darken the image. For sharpness, let's leave this on medium. I think most casual users will find this okay, and high is just overly sharp. Remember that this isn't like bitrate. This doesn't make the footage a higher quality. It's just adding digital sharpness to the footage. Imagine drawing a picture that doesn't look good, but then you go and outline the whole picture with a black marker to give it more definition. The drawing won't all of a sudden become a masterpiece simply because the edges are now darker. And that's kind of how sharpness is. It increases the contrast around the edges of the image to give it an appearance of more definition, and it looks really bad when you overdo it. For color, let's leave it on GoPro color, and that'll give you footage that's ready to go right out of the camera that needs little to no adjustments done. The last two settings are for audio, and I'm not going to cover that in the rest of the settings, but raw audio records a separate audio file from the video just in case you want to edit that separately. And for wind, just leave this on auto, and that helps cut down on the wind noises. Now the next group of settings is for the users who like to mount the camera on them to give a POV shot to show as much of the world in front of them as possible. So for resolution, let's stick with 4K and 24 frames a second, but just apply what I said earlier about choosing your personal preference. But 4K and 24 frames a second is what I choose. For lens, let's set it to super view. It will be distorted, but that's really not a bad thing when you're using it for this purpose because you have a very, very wide field of view, and that's usually what you're going for. The highest hyper smooth setting we can choose is on, and the Pro Tune settings are pretty much the same as last time. High bitrate, auto shutter, zero EV compensation, auto white balance, ISO range from 100 to 1600, medium sharpness, and GoPro color. Next up is for the users that want slow motion. The beauty of a GoPro is that you can mount it in places to get super slow motion views of things that you probably wouldn't want to use a more expensive camera to do. For resolution, I'm going to go with 1080 at 240 frames a second. Now you can shoot in 4K at 60 frames a second, and that'll let you slow down the footage about 2.5 times slower than normal. You can shoot at 2.7K at 120 frames a second, and that'll let you slow down the footage about 5 times slower than normal. But with 1080, you can slow the footage down 10 times slower than normal speed and still have good quality footage. Now, of course, if you want high quality footage and less slow motion, then you can bump it up to 2.7K at 120 or 4K at 60. But for this, I'm going to go with the super slow 1080 shot at 240 frames a second. I have the lens set to linear, but this will depend on how wide of a shot that I need for whatever it is I'm trying to shoot. If linear isn't wide enough, then just go wider and wider until it is. Same thing I said earlier about hypersmooth applies here. The higher the setting, the smoother the footage at the expense of the image cropping in a bit. Pro Tune settings are the same as before, so I'm not going to go over those. And the last setting that I'm going to cover on the GoPro Hero 8 is for the advanced user. This is the person that wants the best, most cinematic footage they can get out of the camera and doesn't care about the inconvenience or editing required to do so. Of course, we're going to go with 4K at 24 frames a second. Only choose a higher frame rate if you plan on doing slow motion. We're going to set the lens to linear to avoid that GoPro distortion and that fisheye look that I was talking about earlier. And hyper smooth is set to boost unless you want the shakes in the footage for creative purposes. Super smooth shots isn't always what's needed for the story that you're trying to tell, so decide on how much stabilization that you want. Skipping down the Pro Tune, bitrate is on high. Shutter speed is set to 1/48, which is double our frame rate that we chose earlier. It's cool that GoPro actually added this feature because most cameras don't have 1/48. They usually go to about 1/50. So it's nice to see that GoPro allows us to actually double our frame rate. This helps to allow smooth and natural looking motion blur. If you chose a higher frame rate earlier, then just make sure that your shutter speed is double whatever you chose. So if you're shooting in 60 frames a second slow motion, then make sure your setting is at 1/120th. EV compensation won't be available because we're setting everything manually. White balance is set to native. This gives you more freedom to adjust the white balance in editing because we don't want the white balance changing between shots, or it'll just give you a lot of trouble if the camera gets it wrong and you have to go and fix it. ISO minimum and maximum is set to 100 because we only want it to increase when we need it to be increased. So if you're in a darker situation where you need to bump the ISO, just make sure that these two numbers match so the camera doesn't change anything on its own. Sharpness is set to low because, like I said earlier, it's just fake digital sharpening being applied, and you can do this very easily when you're editing to the amount that you like. If you let the camera do it for you, then you can't remove any if it adds too much. And for color, we're going to leave it on flat. That'll allow us to color grade with more freedom to do what we want as far as how the footage is colored. Now, chances are if you use these settings and you step outside in the daylight, then your image will likely be way too bright. This is because the shutter speed is slow and is letting in a lot of light. To fix this, we need ND filters, and this will allow you to cut down on the amount of light coming in without having to sacrifice the smooth motion blur. I used the Polar Pro set because the quality of the filters is top notch, but I'm sure that more budget options will come along as time goes on. If you do have ND filters from like the GoPro Hero 7 or 6, then those won't work on this GoPro because the lens mount doesn't come off like it did on the 7 or the 6. So we went over 4 different settings that I have presets for in my GoPro, but remember that you can always mix and match these settings as well. So for example, if you want to use the cinematic settings, but you want to use them for POV shots, then by all means do that. I explained what each setting does, so hopefully that allows you to apply them to your own needs. If not, just leave any questions and comments down below and I'll see if I can help out. If there are any other GoPro videos you want made, just let me know. And be sure, if you found this video helpful, to like, comment, subscribe, and of course I will see you guys in the next one.